Today I'm going to go over with you how to replace the bearings in your Scorpion 2520 series motor. Now first I'm going to go over with the tools you're going to need to make this job happen. Number one is either a rubber mallet or a plastic mallet. You could use a hammer, a regular hammer, but this is really ideal for the job. You're also going to need some pliers. Ideally you're going to use snap ring pliers, but I don't own a pair of snap ring pliers, so I have to make do with what I have. So instead of snap ring pliers, I'm going to use regular pliers and a little flathead screwdriver. You're going to need a bearing retainer compound in order to install the new bearings. I'm using 680, Loctite 680. I don't recommend using Loctite 680 for this job. I recommend 641. It's not as strong, but this is all I have, so I'm going to have to make do. You're going to need a little applicator and a basin to put your Loctite on. You know, you don't want to put it on your fancy wood table, because you know your spouse or your parents are probably not going to like that. Obviously you're going to need your bearings. You're going to need some tools in order to remove your motor from your helicopter, as well as to help push the bearing out. Now I'm going to use a hex driver to help me knock the bearing out of the old bearings out of the motor. And lastly, you're going to need, obviously, your motor, which is in my helicopter right now. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the motor from the helicopter, and we'll take it from there. Alright, now that I've got my motor removed from my helicopter, it's time to actually pull the rotor off of the rest of the motor. The first thing you need to do is you need to remove this little snap ring right here. If you don't have a set of snap ring pliers, you could use a regular set of flat pliers such as this or similar. This gets a little bit more difficult with larger motors, but with a small motor like this is relatively simple. So what you're going to do is you're going to insert the pliers and grab just one side of that snap ring and gently lift it off, and then with your flat screwdriver work that ring up onto the collar of the shaft. It can be a little bit tricky, but it's fairly simple, as I will demonstrate for you right now. Be careful not to lose the snap ring. And there you go. Snap ring is off. There's a little washer here. Please do not lose this washer. Put it in a safe place. Now, just remove the rotor by pulling it right off. You want to be careful not to snap it back. So just carefully pull it right out of the motor. And there you go. This is a good time to inspect your motor for any damage or debris. I got a little bit of dirt in mine, but it's not a big deal. Alright. Now you could put the rotor aside, because we're not going to be doing anything to the rotor here. What we're doing here is we're removing these two bearings. Now in order to do so, what you're going to do is you're going to grab a hex driver, or maybe a flathead screwdriver that is similar to this, small, and insert it through one end of the motor until you, at an angle, until you grab the bearing, until you feel the resistance. As you can see, I got a little bit of resistance there. And then just take the motor in a rag and tap the bearing out. See, it's starting to come out. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to alternate where you actually make contact with with the bearing. I'm going to use the outer bearing as an example, but if I hit it here first, I'm going to want to hit it on the opposite side next. So then do the same thing, and boom. Leave it out, and there you go. Got one bearing out. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the other bearing. Now, while you're doing this, you want to be very careful to not damage these windings. They are coated. If you scratch one of them, you pose frying your motor out and potentially destroying the speed controller on your helicopter as well. So you have to take very great care to make sure you don't damage those windings. It's another reason I actually use a rag. Number one, if I slip, I'm not going to stab myself with the screwdriver. Number two, I'm preventing any damage from happening to the actual windings. So I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. There it goes. Sometimes it takes a little bit. Now, don't worry too much about damaging the old bearings, because you're replacing them anyway. And this process generally renders the old bearings useless. Alright, I'm just gonna go ahead and clean this up, and then we'll get to installing the new bearings. Alright, now that I got everything cleaned up and ready, I'm going to install the bearings. And what I meant about cleaning it up was you want to remove the old retaining compound from the slots for the bearings and clean up any oil that might be there from running the motor. Okay, next, you don't want to get rid of your old bearings just yet. Keep them handy because you actually might need them when you're installing the new ones. So what you're going to do is first clean up the bearings. There might be some oil on them. Oil is not going to help, so you want to clean them up. Alright. Get your Loctite. Shake it up. You could actually use the little case the bearings came in to hold the Loctite, just so you don't make a mess. Try to refrain from putting it directly onto the bearings, because you tend to put too much on that way, and if you put on too much, you might not be able to replace those bearings in the future. Not that you should really have to with these particular bearings, but if you're using other bearings or something like that, you know, or if you crash and you destroy your bearings, even though that's very rare, you might have to replace them in the future. So I don't recommend going crazy with the compound. You only need a little bit, especially if you don't have the right stuff like I'm using, because this is not the right stuff. You want to use 641, not 680. Then you're going to want to use even less. Okay? So what you're going to do is take your bearing, take a little applicator, and put a very thin film of this stuff on the bearing. I have to use even less because I'm using the wrong stuff. Okay? Just a very thin film is all you need. You should, when you're done, you shouldn't even see the stuff on there. If the outer race of the bearing is tinted with the color of the compound you're using, then you're using too much. Unless you have hawk eyes or something, I don't know. But I've got very good eyes, and I can barely see the stuff on there. Alright? Then we're going to start inserting this bearing into the motor. Okay? Line it up. Whoops, that's not lined up. Line it up and just try to gently press it in. Okay? That's probably not going to work, so what you're going to do is you're going to take the old bearing, you're going to put it directly over the new bearing, and then you're going to tap it in. Now what this does is it pushes the bearing in using the outer raceway of the bearing. This does not put any stress on the balls of the bearing or the inner race of the bearing, so it does not actually damage the bearing. What you don't want to do is use like a big screwdriver or something to push the bearing in by the inner race, like this. You don't want to do that, because what's going to happen is that inside the bearing, the balls are going to get shocked against the raceways, and you're actually going to pit the bearings, the inside of the bearings, and you might as well not even replace the bearings in that case, because you're damaging the bearings off the get-go. So you don't want to do that, okay? So here's where we're using the old bearings to help us install the new bearings. Gently tap them in. This might take a couple of tries. Be careful not to damage the windings. Also why I say use a rubber mallet. With a regular hammer, you're probably going to destroy the motor. Now normally, we would actually heat up the bearing block, but because this is a motor, we can't really heat it up. We're going to damage the actual windings. So you don't want to do that. Usually they slide right in, but that doesn't seem to be the case this time. Okay guys, now as you see, I got it in there now. I had a little bit of trouble getting it in. What happened is I had a little bit of dirt in there, and I also actually managed to put the bearing in a little bit sideways, so you have to be extra mindful of that. If you find yourself in the same situation as I do, try to see which way the bearing is actually tilted, and when you place the other bearing on top of it, try to tap that bearing on the higher side. When you're doing this, you want to make sure you cover these windings up. So what I did was I took my rag and I covered up the windings like so, and then I tapped it in. It should only take a couple of taps. Also, another tip: if you happen to have an arbor press, you could just do it that way. It'll be more efficient, and you won't have to be fussing with a hammer. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and install the other side. I'm going to do the same thing. You're going to clean the bearing up. And you're going to apply your thread lock to the bearing. And the reason I say don't put it on the inside, put it on the bearing itself, is because if you put it on the inside, what could potentially happen is, suppose you got a little bit too much on there, when you install the bearing, it will act like a squeegee, and it will actually squeegee all of the compound down the bearing block and out towards the center, and it might actually work its way into the bearing, and it'll gunk up the bearing, and that's just like trying to do what I was mentioning earlier with tapping the bearing in the wrong way. You don't want to do that. So it's the same, it's not the same concept, but it's a similar outcome. Alright? Now, one thing we're going to do different here is you're going to use a rag, soft microfiber cloth, to place the motor down onto, because once again, you don't want to damage those windings. You want to be as careful as you possibly can. Okay? Don't make the mistake I previously did. Make sure that that bearing is as straight as possible. It should just pretty much slide right in. Okay. And carefully tap that in. There you go. That's the way it's supposed to go in, not the way it was happening with me on the other side. Okay, so now just make sure you wipe away all of your excess, and there you go. Your bearings, or your new bearings, are now installed. Now you can put the motor back together. Now normally there's supposed to be a washer in here. Oh, there it is. You see there's a washer in here? There it is. if you just check that the washer is there, because you know it might have, when you took the motor apart, it might fall out, and if it did fall out, you want to find that washer, because it does serve a purpose. It redistributes forces, and it prevents wearing the aluminum rotor against the steel bearing. So that's why it's there. Okay, installing the rotor back, simple. Grasp the motor just like I'm doing here, and slowly start inserting it. At this point, the motor is going to want to snap in. You want to do this slowly. Just like that. Okay? All good. Put your spring washer back on and install your snap ring. Here it should be as easy as just pretty much sliding it down the shaft. Ideally, you should really use a new snap ring here, because I did actually damage mine a little bit, but that's okay. Just squeeze it back together. Okay, one more quick little lesson. Now you're probably wondering why I broke my snap ring. Well, the reason is that I've actually examined this motor a few times, because this was a prototype. And I actually removed and replaced that snap ring 3 or 4 times, and I actually fatigued the metal. You're really supposed to use these things once or twice at most. So when you take one off, you're supposed to replace it. You're not supposed to put it back on 4 more times like I did, because in that case you might actually break your snap ring, or you might damage it and it might break in flight and you might not notice. So don't make the mistake that I did here and just buy yourself a bag of snap rings. In this case, it's a 4mm shaft, so you're going to need a snap ring for a 4mm shaft. You could actually get it direct from the manufacturer, I believe. If not, I'll try to put a link down in this video, okay? Get yourself some extra snap rings, because they tend to get lost and get broken. I do have an extra one, but it's buried away in my toolbox, so I'm going to go ahead and replace that. But in essence, that's it. Your bearings are replaced and you're good to go. So now go ahead and put the motor back in your helicopter, set your gear tension, or your belt tension in my case, or your gear mesh, and go and fly that helicopter. Alright? Thanks for watching, guys.